Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is a little bit of a different format for me. I've really not done a webinar where I can't see or interact with individuals, um, easily. And so the first thing, I just want to make sure that everybody can see me and hear me okay. And so we have a chat box and we have a Q&A box. So the chat box would be if you're just kind of thinking some things as you go or checking in with individuals, commenting, that's a place for that. If there's a question that you want to ask, please put that in the question and answer section, and I will make sure to get to those. So I see in our chat that, thank you. I'm hearing that they can hear and see me. Thank you. That's great. And I probably need some people to check in every once in a while to make sure that you can still hear and see me as we go. If anything comes up, I do have a moderator that's on, but sometimes it's hard to multitask and see everything at one time. So just get real obvious if there's something going on that you need help with. Just first of all, a little bit of just kind of setting up this presentation. So there are, as I said, the question and answer. And so what I'm going to do is we are going to have a 10-minute break about an hour in, since this is a 2-hour presentation. And at that 10-minute break, we're going to do whatever you need to do to get yourself comfortable. But if you haven't at that point asked a question and you want to have a question asked, that's a good time to put that in there so that I can review the questions and make sure to address them as we go. If for some reason we run out of time, then I will take a couple more minutes at the end to answer questions. I did get permission from CEO that I could stay on a little bit longer. We wouldn't get kicked off, but I also know everyone has a lot of things to do. So if you have a question that I couldn't address, or maybe you just didn't want to ask it in front of others, feel free to reach out to me via email, which you'll see at the end. Okay, couple other things, since this is something where you will get some credit. CEO and the certifying body does require that you stay on for the entire time. And so the last probably 15 minutes, so I'd say we're going to go about an hour, 10-minute break, and then about 30, 45 minutes we'll continue. I have lots of things to cover today. Then we will go into really some question and answers at that time. So please stay till the end. I think hearing what the other attendees, what they ask about is just as important as anything that I may say. Okay, last thing that I was told to say is that the dashboard will allow you to do the PowerPoints. Now there's a reason you do not yet have access to these PowerPoints. This actually has some personal information about me in this PowerPoint. And so after this presentation is done, you are going to get a copy of the presentation minus those sections that are about my specific personal stuff, just because that wasn't something I wanted distributed widely. So as soon as you're done, you'll be able to go back into your dashboard. You'll be able to do the survey, get your CE credit, and then get a download of those slides. Okay, so I think we're ready to get started. I'm going to sneak over here 1 second. Sorry, I forgot to grab a Kleenex. Okay, so we are going to start. This presentation is Understanding the Neurodivergent Mind in the Workplace. And this comes from my perspective as a neurodivergent neuropsychologist. And we'll kind of talk about what that means. One of the things I actually want to kind of talk about is what is neurodivergence? Why is this important to you in the industry that you may be in? And what are things that we can do to help individuals who are neurodivergent be accessible and want to work in your industry? And then also, how does that benefit you? So these are things that I hope to cover as we go along. Okay. So the first thing we're going to really talk about, and these are just my goals for this presentation, is understand autism. And the reason I say understanding autism is for those of you who may not be familiar with autism and neurodivergence. Autism is an example of what we call now a neurotype, but it was what at some time was really considered only in the pathology and the disorder aspect of it. And there are absolutely obstacles when somebody has autism or is autistic. And I use those interchangeably as I go throughout based on people's preference. Everyone has different preferences about identity first or person first, and I change them as I go. But these areas, autism and neurodivergence, there's a lot of things that really wasn't understood. So kind of think of the things you've heard about as the tip of the iceberg. And many times what you may picture as somebody who's autistic could be those stereotypical things that you might have seen on TV, Rain Man or Atypical. There are some characteristics that might actually look like that with somebody that's autistic, but many times that's really just a character of a caricature really of what you might expect for there. So we'll talk more about that. The second thing is, this is something where understanding these individuals with neurodivergence, and there's many people out there, they really want to be in your industry. They want to be a part of it. They want to deep dive and do the tasks that you want them to do, and they want to make it their life's work. So this is moving from just having a part-time job or having individuals that are really just doing a job just to do a job, to people that are invested in your industry and want to stay involved because it's what they love. So the next thing we'll talk about is understanding the potential strengths of hiring of neurodivergent individuals, and also recognizing obstacles and accommodations. This is definitely not rose-colored glasses. There are absolutely obstacles that we'll talk about and how to navigate them, whether from an individual standpoint or more universal design standpoint. And then learning about factors that support hiring, training, retention, and occupational success of autistic and other neurodivergent individuals. So here, this is me. So I've worked with families, kids in particular, for many years. I am predominantly a neuropsychologist. I specialize in understanding neurodivergence across the lifespan. So autism, dyslexia, ADHD. This is where I live in my world of clinical stuff. I do evaluations and come up with treatment plans to help individuals thrive. That's really always been my goal. It's not just help them survive, but get them past just survival mode into thriving. And this can be done through understanding their strengths and weaknesses. And so this is really what I do in neuropsychology. But in addition to doing this in my clinical practice, I also consult at schools for this. I do some forensic work as well, and have done this for probably about 25 years. I also do some teaching at the local university, where I teach about neuropsychology and neurodiversity affirming evaluations in general, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then in addition, I am the founding member and associate editor of a new magazine that's coming out actually end of this week or next week, called Autistic Revolution. And that's actually an international work that I have been involved with for over a year. So that will be something that will showcase autistic writings, poems, lots of different things to really help people understand the strengths that can come also when someone is autistic. What I would like to find out, though, is who's in the audience. I would love to see if you can tell me, you don't have to be too specific, but in general, do you come from working as a banker? Are you a psychologist? Are you a researcher? So if you feel comfortable, put in the chat box kind of what general industry you're in. You may be somebody that works from home. You may be somebody that currently is between work. That is so good. So I'm not going to say who said what. You all can probably see that on there, but we definitely have a wide variety of individuals, some human resource, some psychologists, some trainers, some nonprofit, forensic psychologists, working at the library. Side note, that was what I always wanted to do, was work in a library, but that was before they automated the timestamp. I really wanted to be in a place where I could stamp. That was my lifetime goal when I was young. It did switch at some point. So that's the librarian there. A lot of HR, nonprofit and HR. So it's great. I'm glad to have such a wide variety of individuals that are on here, and teachers. I said that someone there is a teacher as well. Okay, so I don't want you to put anything on your chat box about this. This is just something I want you to think about. And that is, have you heard of neurodiversity? Do you think you are neurodivergent, or that you know of somebody that is? And we'll talk more about what that means, meaning, do you socialize, learn, remember things, emotionally do things different than others? And I think what you'll find is some people, when people are asked that question, many people say, nope, I pretty much do things probably similar to others. But you'll hear some, and you might even notice this for yourself, you're like, yeah, I know I do this differently than others. And so part of this paradigm shift from a medical model pathology shift of this is a disorder to this is identification of a neurotype is looking into those things that can also be strengths, and while also overcoming those obstacles. And then finally, do you believe you might have somebody that you work with who might be neurodivergent? So those are all things I just want you to keep in mind as we go through. Whoops, I apologize. Okay. So first of all, I just want to go over a little bit of the summary of what we're going to be talking about. I'm hoping that I'll kind of preface this with these main points, what we'll be talking about. Then we're going to do a little deep diving into a couple of different areas. Then I'll bring it back home and we'll talk about some of these things and hopefully have some actionable steps of some things that you can kind of take from this about how this could impact you, either yourself personally or within the industry that you work. So neurodiversity in the workforce is a concept that recognizes and values the diverse range of neurological differences among individuals. So neurodiversity is all of us. So every one of us on this presentation, but really every one of us in the world, we are neurodiverse. So that is all the groups combined, neurotypical and neurodivergent, and within those neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, all of those. Then if you look at that group of all of us combined, if we were to take those individuals that thought differently, socialized differently, learned differently, whether they're diagnosed formally or not, those individuals are neurodivergent, meaning that they have a difference in how they do things, and they are different than what's the neurotypical, more common way to do things. So one of the shifts in the understanding that I hope you get from this presentation is that there for many years has been the medical model of if somebody talked and they were autistic and they didn't communicate well, it was their issue and they needed to fix it. What we're understanding is it's not a them issue. It is actually an issue between neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals and how they communicate, how they socialize. So as we're understanding this now, it's not an issue of this is wrong and needs to be fixed. It's an issue of this is a different way of doing things. And by embracing those differences, there are benefits that we can have in each of the industries in which we work. So common types of neurodivergence include autism, ADHD, dyslexia. So dyslexia is really a language-based disorder. It's more associated with reading, but it actually has much deeper issues with memory in general as well. Dysgraphia, which is disorder of written expression, essentially. So this might be having difficulty handwriting or getting the words out on paper. Dyscalculia, which is a math disability. So these individuals cannot hold numbers in their heads. And you may find them, even as adults, counting on their fingers. And this is not about a sign of intelligence. This is truly that their brain does not store that type of information. PDA is pathological demand avoidance. That's a newer concept. Some of you may have heard it, others may not. It really originated from the United Kingdom, which tends to be about 10 years ahead of us in terms of autism, in neurodiversity and understanding. And so that has really now been making its way into the United States of an understanding. OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, traumatic brain injury, and Tourette's. And those are just to name a few of the neurodivergence. Mental health is also considered types of neurodivergence. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, complex trauma. So you think about in your industry, you may have individuals that come on board and are essentially neurotypical, and then throughout that time, something happens and they now are neurodivergent. So this is also something where we can't say, well, we're not going to hire neurodivergent individuals or we're going to catch it before it happens. This is something that can be both acquired and developmental. And then certainly as somebody has, let's say, autoimmune conditions or ages, there could be some differences there that cause them to have some more medical issues that would cause neurodivergence or be associated with neurodivergence. So the first thing that I want to do then about accommodations is talk about what are accommodations that could be helpful. And we're just going to summarize these first. They could be accommodations for social, learning, attention, or physical differences. So social difference, maybe they're not somebody that wants to go out and do the Friday afternoon socialization. And if that's required for their job, or if that's how people make connections, they may be at a disadvantage. And that may be something that could be easily accommodated for. Learning, maybe they don't learn orally, they have to have it in writing, or maybe they have to be able to experientially learn something. Attention, maybe they have a hard time shifting attention or focusing on things they're not interested in. And physical differences. The physical differences often are things that we can see, but internalized neurodivergence are things we often can't see. So these accommodations may have physical components such as changing sensory, because maybe changing the lighting or maybe changing sounds. But those are all different aspects of accommodations. Another occupational accommodation can be education. Education is actually a huge piece of this, and it's something where I'm spending a majority of my time at this point helping educate not only others in terms of providers, meaning primary care providers, but working with teachers and administration at school, but educating students, educating the students early on so that they understand that it's okay to think and learn differently, so that we have individuals that are learning better agency. They're following their own paths versus being kind of pigeonholed into this. You don't do it the same, so we're going to push you off to the side. As I said, modifying the physical space and sometimes job requirements, right? There are some things that some individuals cannot do. If you even think about even for yourself, there may be some things that, you know, if I was put into that job, I would have a hard time, whether it's paying attention, whether it's the distractions around you. There's often things that we cannot do. And this just takes it to another level when someone's neurodivergent. Putting them in that situation really makes them disabled in that situation. But they themselves, if they then are in a different situation, may not be disabled. It's about the environment and what those resources are. Developing a company-wide interest inventory and aligning job tasks with employee interests. I'm all about interest, because when you've got somebody motivated and interested, it really goes a long way into their interest in maintaining that relationship, developing things, innovating. And I think interest learning is going to be a big place to develop, especially probably what I call the wanters. That's the high school age. Increasing access to early mentorship and job training. We have individuals that have really had a lot of focus on behavioral management, especially when they have been identified early on as autistic. And we want to change that to learning more soft skills, learning executive functioning components, how to be independent, how to navigate these things, you know, how to understand when eye contact is needed, but also to educate the industry, educate the employers that eye contact may be uncomfortable for them, but that doesn't mean that they aren't capable of many other things. And then modifying the interview or hiring practice to be more inclusive. And we will talk about each of those more. So the whole goal is that by fostering an inclusive environment that celebrates neurodiversity, organizations can tap into the unique strengths and perspectives of neurodivergent individuals, leading to increased innovation, productivity, and overall success. So then after that, we're going to examine some research, and then we will look at basically a deep dive into several different areas of research. I saw a question about, was this on a different slide? I was just giving a preview of these on the summary focus, and then we're going to deep dive into each of those areas here in just a little bit. Okay, so we're going to start off with a case study, and this is a late identified woman, and this is the sort of individual that you may see in your industry. And depending on what you do, I know we've got a teacher there, they may recognize some of these characteristics and some of the children that are even in their school now. So for this particular individual, when they were first born, within about 9 months, the parents reported that the child was not making much eye contact. She was described as very demand avoidant. In fact, she would cry if they picked her up and would stop crying if they put her down. So the parents are really confused on what do we do about this? This is not what we expected, you know, in terms of when we were parenting. This was not in the parenting books. went to pediatrician, and pediatricians often use an approach that they're going to wait and see how people develop. Now, in this case, because early autism signs in females is different, the first thought was this is probably giftedness, because there's a lot of sensory issues as well. So that was really what the take home was from the primary care provider to the parents, was this was giftedness. But the parents didn't feel settled with that. There was just a lot of distress and concern. So the sensory sensitivities in particular were very, very difficult for the parents to navigate. So brushing of hair, taking a bath, putting on clothing, eating certain foods, everything was a battle if the sensory was not just so. This impacted medical care. This impacted dental care. Anything that, again, there was a physical input and a sensory need became a challenge. So because of these issues and really what seemed to be significant anxiety, this child, they decided to delay kindergarten for about a year. So when she went in, she was a year later than her peers. And this is something that we see. And if there's a time when somebody's going to delay school, I'd rather they delay it in kindergarten than have a child retained later on, just side note. As soon as the child got into school, anxiety was still very prevalent. They were identified as having speech concerns, articulation started, in some word finding. Vocabulary help was done in school. And then by about third grade, they were getting help in math and writing in particular. The reading actually with this child was quite good, very fast reader, but didn't always comprehend what they were reading. So in this case, I think what the parents said was the child was writing their own alphabet. So the teacher could not read what the child was writing. And this was, I think, before typing. So unfortunately, there wasn't some of the accommodations and options that there are now. In the primary years, social differences became noticed. And this is very common for girls, that early on in their development is really sensory and anxiety and just some quirky things we see. But then it's actually the social difficulties that start to show up around third grade and beyond. And at this point, this child in particular had a lot of repetitive behaviors. Some of them were skin picking, just doing different things. And that was pulling the attention of peers, and bullying started. And so from this point on to fifth grade, and then this child goes into middle school, the bullying at this point is so intense that we now likely have almost a trauma situation with school. There was a lot of fear of going to school, lots of bullying at school. And one of the pieces that was happening is because of those learning challenges. Again, think back, already in third grade, these young girls getting these learning supports. You add on the anxiety and the bullying, she was usually doing the worst in class. So if we've got a class of 30 people, and at this time, we still had teachers that would have the students stand up when to show what grade they got. And she would be the last one to stand up because she would have the lowest grade. So many things were impacting this. But due to that, her parents said, this is enough. We're going to make a change. And they actually moved this girl when she was 15 to a different town away from her parents, to a different school, to try to actually change this trajectory. And I will tell you, it didn't do a whole lot of good because she didn't have some of those skills. So this girl goes into this new high school now. She doesn't have new skills. And now there's expectations, and she's older. And what begins to happen is she began eloping. So if you don't know what elopement means with autism, it means somebody running away from situations, usually when they're scared of something. So this girl, who's now a young teenager, is actually doing that in school. She's hiding in the hallways, and she's getting, now we talk about bullying because she has some other peers that are not just bullying, but really giving her some attention that would not be appropriate at that age. She actually fails out of the school. She could not pull that together. And with the elopement and the bullying that then continued, then this last ditch effort was, okay, they put her in a public school. Now this public school, thankfully, had theater and the arts. And that was everything that she needed to connect to that. Now this child still could not read or write or do math, was in remedial math, would not ever be able to read the books that were assigned, read the Cliff Notes or whatever that may be. Writing was still very, very challenging, but it was never identified as really needing supports. It was just assumed that that was their ability. In high school, confidence began to grow, thankfully for this person, but they remained isolated. theater thankfully became their outlet, and they actually went into school in a theater scholarship. From there, in the theater scholarship, they were able to really start to dive into being confident in themselves. And they went to a community college, which made all the difference in the world, because at community college, the professors took the time to help re-educate and really connect with this individual. And they then used their interest in others because they had learned to mask. And actually, theater is a good way to learn to mask sometimes. They used that love of masking and people to learn about others and psychology. And because they'd always been interested in why was their brain different, they then went into neuropsychology. So as you can see, this was me. So I actually had all of those difficulties, failed out of school, had all these different things, and this was what has happened to me. Now, in my early career, at this point, I have found my passion because I figured out what it was that I wanted to do. And I am now doing things that from when I was young, I was actually already invested in. So now I just do this, and I do this to help others. But some of the other things we talk about are still there. The social isolation, continued sensory issues. I've just gotten really good at navigating that. But burnout has happened. And I want to tell you the importance of this whole story is me saying to you, I'm sitting here as a board certified pediatric neuropsychologist telling you this is my history. But even as an adult, there have been times when I have been in burnout, when there's too much stress or people around me and I don't have control over basically the schedule or the sensory input coming in. So I'm hoping that you'll take this as an example of there are people out there, many, and I know I come from a privileged place of being able to talk about this, but I do this now to help others that don't have that voice, that they do have strengths. They just have to have, that development of agency, those supports, and people that connect to them and say, we believe that you can do it. So what we're going to see in this research coming on a little bit later is that these same themes are what other individuals that are neurodivergent and autistic talk about in their workforce. And the last thing I'll say about my history here is that my practice, which now has just 2 of us, used to have 12 to 15 people. And it was that way for about 6 years. And even though that was needed for our community because there weren't a lot of people working with kids, it was so overwhelming for me that I could barely make it into the office anymore. So I had to make a decision, and I had to really do some reflection. And at that point, I decided for my own health and well-being, because of those aspects of myself, I had to do what was right. And I took the practice down, made sure everybody got where they needed to go. I put it mostly in the cloud because that is much less overwhelming than having people face to face. So I want you to take some of these examples and think about when you're talking with somebody and you're interviewing them for the first time and they look awkward when they're in your space. I can guarantee you I would look awkward. I guarantee you I probably wouldn't make eye contact. I would say these silly little jokes that you would think might be inappropriate. So these are the things I just want you to think about. How else can I see if this person might be the right fit for us? Or how else can I see if there might be, maybe this isn't a particular job for them, but maybe something else is a job that would work for them. So my pathway to diagnosis, I'm going to really zoom through this, was the same for many, many individuals. I cannot tell you how many children come through here, and as soon as we're done with the children, the parents are like, oh my goodness, this sounds just like them. And they realize that this too has been there because these are neurotypes that are part of our system. And so I am a mom of 3 neurodivergent children. And so even though I had this whole history of these things that happened to me, it really took seeing all 3 of my kids and realizing, wow, that's what happened to my parents. No wonder they're, so stressed at this point. They all had their diagnoses, and that was the pathway for me. So about 12 years ago, I worked with somebody internationally, again, because we're a little bit further behind in the States. And they did identify me as having Asperger's at that time. And then a few years later, basically, I had to have some genetic testing for my daughter. And while there are not genes specific to autism that are completely solidly yes, there are ones that we know are highly associated with those that do tend to have more autism spectrum symptoms. And I had 4 or 5 of those genes. So now literally after I turned 50, I said, I'm done. I'm done being hiding and masking. I'm coming out. And so I will tell you, my son actually wanted to make sure I put in here in this list of things that make me frightened, that presenting has always terrified me. And that's because I didn't want to reveal who I am. And now I'm revealing, and there we are. And I think that's going to be an important part of this presentation and future ones that are given. Okay, so I'm just going to view over this a little bit. So we've talked about the introduction. Now I'm going to deep dive. So I know someone asked a question earlier about what was I saying on that slide. You're going to see that slide coming up next. We're going to talk about main areas of neurodivergence. And then I think we're actually doing okay with time. The 10-minute break we're not going to use until 1 o'clock. Well, I think that's 2 o'clock your time. I'm at Central Standard Time. So we'll kind of fit that in wherever we need that. Then we have some occupational research we're going to talk about, some occupational supports, and then we'll have time for questions. Okay, so what is neurodiversity? So neurodiversity means, again, all of us combined, we are all together neurodiverse. We're the entire distribution of neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals. The definition from Harvard Medical School is that neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. So this is a huge change. This change is moving slowly through the field. So there's some psychologists that are still a pathology model, and they have to be, maybe for research, for forensics. There's a number of reasons. There are many medical providers who really are still in that area of symptom presentation, and here are the treatments. But this is where the field needs to go. And this is what's going to be important for the industries that I'm hopefully talking to are going to understand, is that this is a significant amount of individuals who don't have work and want to work because they've been misunderstood. And in some parts, they themselves are misunderstood as well. They may not understand themselves, but capturing and tapping into this resource is going to really be pivotal, I think, as we move into a new age in the industry. The history, so neurodiversity movement, neurodiversity itself was coined by Judy Singer, who's an Australian sociologist. There is some controversy about who actually said it first. I will tell you, when we're talking about things that impact so many people, these things come up in more than just one topic. So I will say definitely her name is associated with this, and I really appreciate the efforts that she's done in this field. But there's been lots of individuals that have really built on this concept of neurodiversity and the neurodiversity paradigm. What does neurodivergent mean? As I said, it is the subset of individuals who think, learn, socialize, or have emotional differences, either innate or acquired. It's that neurological differences are normal variations. So kind of think about that again. Yes, if we have some individuals that learn or socialize differently in our office, in our practice, in our business, they may require different accommodations. But what is the benefit? So let's say we look at those accommodations and figure out what do they need. What is the benefit that may give to us as that business to have provided that? What are the strengths that they have that will then commit them to us because they are able to work at their best and able to do their best? And then the actual definition of disability is a little bit different than probably what some of you have heard of before. So in this concept, disability does not just mean I have autism, so I'm disabled, or I have ADHD, so I'm disabled. It is actually a balance between those dynamic neurotypes, neurodevelopmental differences, and the environment they're in. Think of me back when I had this office of a dozen or more individuals, and I couldn't get into the office. I couldn't do my work. That was me getting to a point of meltdown, burnout, and disability. As soon as I was able to make that change, and it took a couple of years. I mean, I'm talking about it briefly now, but this was quite a lot of stress that went into that. That then led me to a place where I'm not disabled. Now, if someone were to tell me that tomorrow I have to go work at McDonald's and I have to do it through the checkout line, I literally could not do that. I would be disabled in doing that job. So it is an environment specific thing that goes with the person's individual neurotype differences. So neurodivergent may present in many different ways. Often there is shared overlap among these neurotypes. I tell people all the time, the brain does not know these categories. These are things that have been arbitrarily delineated as these are the symptoms of this, these are the symptoms of this. There's so much shared overlap that a lot of times what we call is co-occurring conditions. It used to be thought that ADHD and autism couldn't exist at the same time, which anybody that actually was autistic knew that was absurd. Those two things live along a continuum. The same is true for learning differences. If somebody is deeply dyslexic, they likely have dysgraphia, and dyscalculia often comes along with it. So these things really go based on just how the brain neurotype is, not how we call it. But in general, I'm going to give you the main things that you might see. So the autism. So I think the CDC recently said 1 in 36 children with autism. So think about the classrooms with our classroom size being around 30. That means probably one child in that classroom is autistic. And I've seen some estimates that have said 1 in 20. So really, it is something that when you think about autism, I really want the first thing you think of is Dr. Jennifer said to say, that is not what you think it is. And that's exactly what I want you to understand. It isn't what you think it is. It is a lot more of nuances, but there's also a lot of strengths that individuals have not typically recognized. The problem is because of kind of the stereotypical view of autism, many individuals that are autistic are not employed, or most importantly, are underemployed. And I want to give you an example of individuals, and this is just not one person I've seen in my practice. This is an example of, I'd say, probably 100 people I've seen in my practice who are brilliant. When you actually measure their intellectual functioning, they're probably smarter than me. I mean, they are very, very bright, but their executive functioning, their soft skills, their emotional quotient is impaired. So much to the point that they cannot navigate applying for a job, making it to the interview, and then being there to actually, do the interview, make it through, follow up in whatever way is needed, and then to actually start that job. So it is not about intelligence, but I want us to really get past this stereotypical view of these things and understand that it's much more dynamic than that. So 83% of autistic adults unemployed in 2017. This has not gotten that much better. I will tell you in the research we're going to look at, what I love seeing is many of the autistic people involved in that research, and some of the research was done by autistic individuals. We have people with PhD and master's level. So now we're really getting to what it should be. We have individuals with a wide variety of skills, and the job is helping that individual find the job that works for them, or the point is finding a job that works for them, and helping the industries embrace those individuals. ADHD and the new subtype AUDHD, which is autism and ADHD combined. That's not something you'll see in the DSM, but it is definitely something that seems to be clinically relevant, if not scientifically relevant. Many individuals have ADHD. And before I move on, I should say, so what are some of those kind of stereotypical symptoms of autism? And I will tell you, social communication deficits. What those are differences. So it's differences in how somebody communicates. So in your workforce, you think about somebody who likes to walk through the halls and small talk. If I see somebody small talking, I'm turning and walking the other way because it's so uncomfortable. So that is not necessarily a social deficit that I don't want to small talk, because in your industry, that may not be necessary. But if it's a job where I'm customer service, and small talk, you pretty much need it in customer service, or if I'm on the floor and I'm working in a clothing store, then small talk may be essential to your job. So those are the things I want you to be thinking about. Restricted specialized interests. So I'm not kidding when I say that from the time I was in middle school, because I recognized I learned differently, that I really was fascinated with the brain. I have not real brains, but I have plastic brains and toy brains all over my office. I collect them. That is my area of interest. When I stumbled upon the topic neuropsychology as an undergrad, it was like a light bulb. I knew at that moment that's what I was going to do, and that is just where I have been. And that is the sort of spirit that you will have from individuals. Their specialized interest or their restricted interest becomes the thing that they love and they specialize in, and they will know more than anybody else about that thing. And then repetitive behavior. So I talked about those repetitive behaviors. Those repetitive behaviors are the stimming things, the people that are tapping. You know, you'll see kids in class many times now with sensory tools. You'll see the people constantly rocking and doing things like that. Those are subtle repetitive behavior. There are some that are more substantial and that do require more accommodations. Common symptoms for common presentations for ADHD, executive functioning differences. So this is difficulty with planning, organizing, working memory, inattention, but often hyper-focus on things they're interested in. That's something they share with their autism colleagues. Behavioral dysregulation. So sometimes you'll see impulsivity, you'll see emotional dysregulation. So this may be somebody that's very reactive to the things that they see or experience. And rejection sensitivity, something that's very common with ADHD individuals. One of the things I believe is that when someone has ADHD, they themselves, it's very confusing for them because they are so inconsistent. Their stamina is different day to day. Based on the task that's given to them, it can be challenging. So they feel like an imposter because they know that they can't always present in the same way. So there is a lot of rejection sensitivity that ADHD individuals experience. And that actually does apply for other areas of neurodivergence as well. Dyslexia and dysgraphia, these are our individuals with language differences. We may have hyperlexic readers, meaning they read fast but don't comprehend. We may have people that cannot spell. I'm raising my hand. I literally cannot spell. Thank goodness for spell check. And even handwriting is a challenge for many. So then you think about, again, what is the job that they're going to do? If their job is a job where they don't have to write something, so now they're a lawyer, they can dictate and somebody else writes it for them, that's not going to be a problem. But if they're writing a ticket because they're a mechanic someplace and what they write down has to be accurate, that could be a challenge. So in that instance, it might need accommodations. And quite frankly, having a secretary or having somebody that does type up dictation, that is an accommodation, actually. It's just one that we've more commonly accepted than some of the other accommodations. And then the dyscalculia, like this would be somebody that needs a calculator. They count on their fingers. They don't always know time. They tend to be the individuals that kind of time passes. They don't realize that they've been doing something for quite a long time. Poor mental calculation. They're not good usually at giving change. So this is somebody that, again, you think of them calculating money as a cashier, that might be a challenge if they have to do that in their head. Okay. So how do you know if your employee is neurodivergent? And the question is, you won't always know. That is the answer to that question. You won't always know who's neurodivergent because many neurodivergent individuals mask. And masking is actually a phenomenon that many of us do. Many of us go do things we don't always want to do. But when we're talking about masking with a neurodivergent individual, they're doing it in a pervasive way that impacts their functioning, and they have to focus on it very effortfully. And they've usually had to practice it and learn how to mask in this process. So masking is probably happening where you work or with people that you are affiliated with. But masking is associated with burnout. It is very effortful. It's kind of like, I like to think of it as a computer program. So think if you are running a computer program, you're working on your computer, and there is a huge program running in the background that's taking up all of your memory and usage. That is exactly what masking does. It takes up this allocation of resources so that these individuals can't do other things. They may not disclose due to stigma. So this is a biggie, right? If I say Asperger's or autism or ADHD, you get a picture in your mind of what that is. You get an assumption, because that's what we've really learned to do through TV and social media. We're trying to change that assumption, but it happens slowly. And that may even be regional. You know, I live near Chicago. What somebody may be comfortable talking about in Chicago may not be the same as what they feel comfortable talking about in central Illinois, in farmland, right? So there's differences in stigma. And unfortunately, that's going to stay like that for quite a while. So this is something that has to be addressed at probably the HR level with companies in terms of education and understanding. They may not realize they're neurodivergent. I work with individuals across the lifespan. I usually don't work with anybody younger than 2 because early intervention will help them for free, and I prefer that happens for them. But I've worked with individuals all the way up until their 90s. So this is something that happens across time. People may not know they're neurodivergent. You think of the 70-year-old person who just realized they have ADHD. And the reason they realized it is because they were noticing some differences, but when they actually could pull up all of their data, and I love to see school records when I'm doing evaluations, they had reports of attention difficulties all the way through school. So did their capacity eventually outstrip their ability to do things? Yes. So then they really were having more struggles and difficulties, but they already had some of those neurotype early on. And that's important to know. But think of how long that person existed without that understanding. And they just thought maybe often there was something wrong with them, that they couldn't do things that others could do and didn't understand why and didn't know to ask for help. Individuals may not know that help is available or understand their rights. They may fear they will lose their job, and they may fear discrimination from fellow employees or employers. So all of these things are real and they happen to individuals. And so keep in mind, there was 12 years from when I really had confirmation that I had Asperger's or autism. And when I've talked about it more openly, and really that's because of that stigma. And mainly, it wasn't even just for me, it was for the stigma that I was afraid of what it would do to my children, and also that I was afraid it would stop me from being able to help other individuals like myself who needed that help early on. So that stigma is really impacting lots of people, and it may be impacting people at all levels of your work. So we are at 12:49, so we're going to take just a couple of minutes to talk to the Americans with Disabilities Act. I assume most of you know this information. Is very easy to find online if you do not. It's essentially a civil rights US legislation that protects individuals with physical and mental disabilities and guarantees them equal opportunity in public accommodations, employment, transportation, state and local government services, and telecommunications. So what's important is that it says that this physical and mental impairment substantially limits one or more major life activities. There's some variability about what that major life activity is, but if we have somebody at work and they're not able to do their job, that is a limiting factor for a disability causing that. The same goes for school. So I work with lots of kids in school. So in the school, it'd be a Section 504 accommodations, where that is where that civil rights would come in, where they would be have access to education the same as their non-disabled peers. The provisions apply to employers with 15 or more, and there was some rollout across time. But I think, again, online, you should be able to find this information. What I want you to understand, though, is that the examples of the disabilities covered are many things. There's medical things, there are neurodevelopmental, there are things that are more acute. So we think of how many of these things, if you look at the bottom of examples of disabilities covered, how many of those things would somebody physically be able to see? And this is one of the issues that does come up when individuals talk about it, whether it's HR or employers say, how do I identify these people? We can't go out and stereotype somebody and say, oh, I see because you're using this fidget tool, you may be disabled. What we have to do is we have to educate the entire group of employees and make sure everyone understands, make sure our policies are clear. If somebody has needs that they need accommodations for, they need to come to those individuals and have that an open communication channel. These things, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, OCD, TBI. So reminder of what I said earlier, these are things that you may have what is seemingly a neurotypical employee who then has one of these things happen, who's no longer neurotypical. They may now need accommodations based on those things. They may need accommodations due to the cancer, HIV, deafness, hearing loss, any of those things may happen. And when it comes to the neurodivergence of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, it's often about whether or not they understand what it is they need and the dynamic aspect of that. So if you have somebody that comes in and they are autistic and they say to you, I know I need sensory supports. You're like, great, I'll never have to give them sensory supports. They're not gonna need anything else, so this is easy peasy. All of these things are very dynamic with the environment. So they may find as they work in your agency or industry that they actually are struggling with communication with their fellow employees, that that's actually impacting their job performance because they're not understanding what people are saying, or they don't communicate in the same way, or are being discriminated against. So in that case, even though they came in with the understanding of what accommodation they thought they needed, and there was a kind of an agreement of this is what they have at this point, they may need other things along the way, as would anybody that's neurotypical may need accommodations along the way. Okay. So one of the things when I talk about accommodations, there is the concept of universal design. And this really is about increasing the ease of access to products, places, and services for multiple diverse populations. And I think that's really what I want you to be thinking about. How do we make these things accessible to more individuals? In my son's school, and this is an urban school, they actually have a sensory room. That sensory room, you do not need to have an IEP or a 504 to go into that room. It has a meditation space. It has a little place for sensory. It has like some different things if you needed a snack. That's a universal design. That is something that any student in that 1,500 student school could go in there when they needed that, and it helped make that accessible to all. So the universal design, it can be applied to many different things. And it really is coming at what are things that would benefit, let's say, let's say we're working with State Farm, who's not far from here in Bloomington, or we're working with Caterpillar, doing an interest inventory, looking at what are things that would make people's quality of life better at work, and using those to make some universal design decisions. Okay. And for those who may not have heard in the beginning, I did not give the slides prior because I did not want to include the information of my private story on there. So there is a copy of the slides without those 4 or 5 slides in there that will be available on CEGO. You'll just need to complete your survey, and from there you can get your certificate and the slides. Okay. Thumbs up if everyone's ready to dive in. Okay, very good. I do see somebody has their hand raised. Let me see, okay. Okay, very good. Okay, so this is an introduction to some research studies. So you're actually going to jump into my world now and deep dive. I love to deep dive about things, and I've spent most of my life deep diving about these things from an educational standpoint and how these things impact individuals, their development of their self-esteem, their understanding of their strengths and weaknesses. And trust me, that's where this work has to be started, because those individuals are already learning skills once they get to the workforce. So because this was part of this presentation, I wanted to share with you some of those studies that look at what does this look like in current employee situations. What I love about some of the research I was able to find, it's recent, which is important because remember, we're really looking at a shift from that pathology medical model to a neurodiversity affirming model. And not only with that shift, does that help us to understand more strength-based, but it helps us to understand the number of individuals that are likely impacted by this. And this research is not only used with autistic individuals, some of it was done by autistic individuals. So that was really cool. Okay. You'll also see in these next few research studies that many of them are autistic specific versus neurodivergent. And that is simply because that neurodivergent title is a little more general and broad. So typically the research studies use a predominant neurodivergent type. So in this case, autism. So that is what the context is of these studies mostly. But this applies to many areas of neurodivergence because, again, remember, the brain doesn't know these categories. There's a ton of shared overlap in common occurrences. Okay. Okay, so the first study was looking at the strengths and abilities of autistic people in the workplace. This study, which was by Cope and Remington, was actually a self-report study. So they actually did an online, I think, Qualtrics survey of autistic individuals. And I believe it was both self-identified or formally diagnosed. I can double check that. But they asked them to talk about the areas where they had strengths and also the areas that they knew they had some difficulties and obstacles. Excuse me. So some of the first strengths that were noted by these individuals were enhanced local processing ability. So what this means is sometimes autistic individuals, and this also goes for myself, will struggle with seeing the big picture. So this is like walking into a room, seeing several desks, seeing some pencils, seeing a blackboard or a chalkboard, and then seeing a person sitting there and realizing, oh, that's a classroom, versus somebody else walking in and realizing immediately that that's a classroom that they've walked into. So one of the things, when somebody has this different view, they are very attentive to the details. And in particular, visual details are things that are very strong for individuals. So kind of data finding in coding and things like that, they may be very, very good at that. They tend to feel that they are more reliable. What I loved about this, again, is autistic individuals saying it's about themselves. Other research that I then will talk about in a little bit shows that to be true from employers as well, that they found them more reliable, that they possess a strong sense of social justice and integrity. This is really a big theme for autistic and neurodivergent individuals, kind of making sure that others are taken care of, and fairness is a big part of what's done. You'll see there are whole articles about autistic and dyslexic police officers and lawyers, because they really go into those fields. In particular, the military, even though the military doesn't want ADHD individuals, or they in some way have to be maybe in the Air Force, or they can't be on medication, they actually do quite well, because the Army functions as their executive functioning system, and they excel in that situation. Attentive to detail, which is kind of like that small detail focus, but in this attentive to detail, they tend to find patterns in things. Patterns that to them seem obvious, to others don't seem obvious. So pattern finding and attentive to detail. Original problem solving. Thinking outside the box is definitely this, dyslexia has had its moment in the sun, where basically people are realizing these are the wonderful parts of dyslexia. There are many entrepreneurs and billionaires, millionaires that are dyslexic because they've had to learn how to do it differently. And that is along with my autistic presentation, that dyslexia is definitely there, so I can attest to that. I cannot think inside the box. Some individuals, it's like they were given a manual and they understand things. I wasn't given that quote unquote manual. I don't understand it. So I have to claw my way to figure things out in any way that I can. And that leads to innovation, and it leads to people thinking really novel ways of navigating through, because they get rid of what those expectations are. They tend to be honest. Many of them have superior intellectual functioning. However, I will say, again, go back to that caveat. That sometimes does not help somebody. They can be extremely bright, but when they don't have those soft skills and executive functioning and supports, they do not know how to navigate those everyday circumstances that come with the job. And technical abilities, that's something that's pretty stereotypically an autism thing, but I will tell you, some individuals are savvy and some are not. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, nobody's alike, okay? Even if we're looking at autism or we're looking at dyslexia, within that, everyone's gonna have their own strengths and weaknesses. We're just kind of looking at commonalities. So I like this, had like a schematic drawing here of what were these different skills or strengths that they talked about, and what did they really, what was kind of the category that they fell under. And I'm going to show you here real briefly. I have these written out, so this can be overwhelming to look at this one, but I just wanted to show you how these are connected. So there are cognitive advantages, efficiency, strengths related to personal qualities, and a unique autism's perspective. All of those were strengths that they saw. So let's look at the cognitive advantages. Again, these are things we've talked about a bit, some of this error detection, attention to detail, pattern finding, creative and innovative. Efficiency, efficient and able to work independently. Now think about what a contrast. When you think of what is stereotypically thought of for an autistic individual, what do we think of them? Dependent, needing help, needing support, needing someone to tell them what to do. We have individuals saying who are autistic that they work well independently, and later we'll see employers say that as well. Once they know the task, it's kind of hands off. They've got this. Personal qualities, honest, reduce social pressure. So think about, again, these people walking in the hallways, talking and chatting. How do we get groupthink situations where we have somebody, we want to have these really innovative ideas, but all of a sudden everyone starts agreeing with each other? Individuals that are autistic are less likely to do that because, one, they're not talking to all those other individuals, and it's really important to them to have their own view, and they have that view of integrity and justice. I've highlighted increased empathy because if there's anything that is one of the biggest kind of misunderstandings about autism, is that they don't have empathy. And I have described this probably for 20 years, that what it is dysregulated empathy and hyperempathy. So they experience probably sometimes stronger empathy than others, but they don't express it in the same way. They don't feel it on the spot as others might because of some of the other sensory and interoception issues. And it may not come out in the same way. So they do not have an impairment in empathy. In fact, it's an understanding from others, which is called the double empathy problem, that really leads to that. So I highlighted increased empathy so that you could remember when you think about autism and empathy, that what you've heard all along is not true. They have so much empathy at times that that's part of the overwhelm that comes from masking. And then dedication. So these are individuals saying that they are dedicated to this, and that is a strength. And you think of any industry, when we're looking at integrity and honesty and dedication, those are the employees we want. We want people that we train and who are connected to us and grow with us as a company. And then the unique perspectives. When you've had to make your way through situations that have been dire, when you have been bullied or you've been in school and you have these things that have been terrible, or you have people that constantly misunderstand you, those are things that you have had to learn to deal with, and you are likely to be able to help others deal with those things. They make great HR managers. And for those, I know there's a couple psychologists on here, there's actually psychology groups online, and there's at least several autistic psychologists in every state. So this is not just me, we're out there. It's just people didn't know that it was okay to talk about these things, and some people weren't yet fully identified. And then some people actually like repetitive behavior. One of my favorite things in graduate school was coding. And now I couldn't learn a foreign language, but I was an amazing coder, and I could find things very easily whenever there was an error. So a perfect example of, again, these skills are things. Now, how would you know that? You'd only know that by talking with me, doing an interest inventory, and then developing those skills if they are good. So the next study I want to look at then is reflections on employment among autistic adults. And these are reflections that come from both employers and employees. And I have several pages of references at the end of this presentation. So the main article that I use this from is on the page, but then you'll see in the back there are several articles that really helped kind of build each of these slides. So in this, they were actually calling, and this is Nicholas and Clegg, they were calling for 5 areas of increased focus in order to really help autistic individuals be a critical and important part of jobs and employment. The first was nurturing long-term success. So I want you to think about this for a moment. So we're not looking for the person that's going to go to McDonald's for the summer. If we're McDonald's, we're looking for that person that's going to start in their high school career and remain with us as a manager because they are committed to us and we're committed to them. We're looking for places that there is long-term success, where they feel like they are thriving, where they are learning and growing along with the rest of the company. And that should be the focus instead of just a paying job like baggage handler. And quite frankly, each of those jobs is important. But we want to make sure that in that instance, those are things that baggage handler has the things that they need to be successful in that job. No different than we want to make sure that lawyer has the secretary that will make sure to write those notes for them. Next is broad and employment readiness efforts. So I talked about those kids again. We have a missed opportunity in all of high school going into really community college, the first 2 years of school, which really should be experiential learning, learning about the self, learning about strengths and weaknesses. Math and reading and writing, those are absolutely important. Some of those things will come with time. The things that we have let go in school are the soft skills, but actually that's what individuals need. And really, the whole neurodiverse population needs those things at this point. We're not just talking about neurodivergent, but in the case of neurodivergent individuals, they absolutely have to have it, because for them, it is disabling when they don't have that support and help. Provide professional development that emphasizes strengths and not disability. So this would be working with your company. So again, we go back to that slide. How do we know who in our agency is neurodivergent? If they don't feel like it's an okay environment to tell, they're not going to come forward. And then that's a problem. That means they're likely not going to be committed and full-term, long-term employee for you. So we want to understand that the culture in your workforce should be one of acceptance and understanding. And this will actually take education. Education about neurodiversity, education about neurotype differences, education about strengths and what those may look like, and education about obstacles and knowing that there's ways to work around them. Build community support is another critical thing that's needed. So we need to focus on how do we help these individuals navigate that very pivotal step. So when I call these high school launchers, it's because they're launching toward adulthood. And one of the biggest times of failure is that leading up to high school, or the end of high school, where we've still usually got pretty strong executive functioning, external control from the parents. And then they jump over into school where the school's like, hey, they're 18, we're gonna let them fly, and they fall flat. So that happens in neurotypicals. Imagine that when that happens to individuals that really struggle with attention and executive functioning and learning. So those community supports are needed, and they're needed early on, and they're really needed for that pivotal launching phase, launching toward college or trades. My husband is a certified welder and welding instructor. He loves it. Very bright man. That's his thing, was hands-on. So again, also looking at helping individuals understand all the possibilities of what it is that they can do. Okay. So that community support, I would love to see community colleges involved more with this, with getting individuals educated about these things, helping employees get educated about them. That would come from HR. That may come from the organizational administration of saying, these are the things we're going to focus on as an employee workforce. We're going to talk about understanding each other. It may sound a little soft science, but that's where longitudinal productivity is. It's in that connection, commitment, and motivation to be at your job. And then striving for a good life. So we're really wanting individuals to go back to what I said earlier. We want them to thrive. We don't want them surviving, we want them to get to the point of thriving to whatever is authentic to them. Not everyone's going to be a neuropsychologist. Not everyone wants to be a bagger or a cashier. Whatever their area is, we should be looking at that and say, what is it they need to be living well and doing what they do? Because that commitment to them really gives back to a commitment to us. So one of the things I loved about this, and this came from a study that was embedded in this other study, and it was like, what were employers saying were some of the best strengths of autistic employees? So think back to when the autistic employees were describing their own strengths, and look what the employers are saying: reliability, integrity, and accuracy. Like, those are huge. That's something, if I've got somebody in my job that's reliable and they have good integrity and they're accurate at what they do, if they need some accommodations in one area or they struggle with that social communication piece, I'm in a better shape if I help shore up those areas than to make it so that they're not possible for them to do that job, because those are skills that we all want in employees. And what do autistic employees say they need? So I think when we think about autism and what are the resources, and again, even just more generally neurodivergent, what are these scary sounding accommodations we're going to have to give them? Look at what they're wanting. They're wanting empathy, neurodivergent acceptance that goes back to that talk about education for the workforce, and autism understanding. They're not asking for a ton of stuff. They're just asking for understanding and acceptance to be embraced for who they are. So this goes into a little bit more about those areas, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. You, again, will have this slide later on. But one of the areas I want to bring your attention to is really number 3. So number 3 is about providing professional development that emphasizes strengths, not disability. So this is where the field has got to continue to evolve toward a neurodiversity affirming paradigm where we are shifting away from a focus on behavior and compliance and moving toward agency, self-understanding, understanding of strengths and weaknesses, ability to advocate for oneself, learning of executive functioning. Those are the skills that individuals need to be able to get successfully into the workforce. And that's going to take a shift in not just the workforce agency and workforce, ecosystem. That's going to take a shift in the pediatricians, psychologists, physicians, therapists, individuals that are working with autistic individuals early on to understand some of those behavioral aspects, in particular things like ABA, do not lead to good employment outcomes. And so we need to be shifting to those soft skills, executive functioning, emotional intelligence, navigating those times between when there's supports for you and how do you do that. Okay. The next place that I wanted to jump to is the workplace adjustments, because this is really what scares everybody. Like, what does this mean? What are we going to have to do to make this feasible? So first of all, we're not going to stereotype and assume that anyone's going to need accommodations. There would be some settings that an autistic individual will go into, and there will not be any accommodations they need. And there might be some that they go into, and it literally is almost disabling by the mere fact of them being there. So we're never going to know exactly what that is, because that's a personal dynamic for them, and we're going to talk about that some more in the next study. So basically, what are reasonable adjustments? And I want to read this quote here. Insufficient support provided in the workplace not only negatively impacts upon autistic individuals, but means that employers are missing out on valuable workplace contributions from neurodiverse employees. Positive contributions are suggested to include innovative solution finding, boosted productivity with good attention to detail and concentration, reliability, and workplace morale. And what we actually will find is that when supports are provided, productivity increases. And that was in a study by Scott et al. That found, what is this balance ratio of what accommodations are needed and what's the payoff? The payoff is that we have individuals that are committed to us, that are living more authentic to who they are and are at that moment doing their best work, right? Remember, all of this masking and stuff that goes on in the background pulls away from allocation of resources to what they can do to focus on the job that they have, that they're doing for you. So these are things that we want to focus on and know that there is a benefit to us. Here's what I thought was so neat about this. So in this study where they're looking at, again, this is autistic employees, and employers were also looking at this. What are the things that were needed? The definition of reasonable accommodations was having a positive impact on employees' well-being and work output, right? So we're not just worried about how great do they feel. We want them to feel good. I mean, honestly, no one's going to feel good all the time, but we don't want them coming to work feeling miserable all the time. That is just not going to produce a healthy, happy, productive employee. But what we see is that when we do make some of these accommodations and they're reasonably done, they do increase work output. The next one, which I thought was so important, was that they don't want something to negatively impact the organization. And just, that wasn't just the employers saying that. That was the autistic employees saying that as well. They want to have the accommodations they need to be successful, but they're aware that these things come at a cost, and they want to make sure that they do not negatively impact the organization. Many individuals believe that these things should be available for all employees. That gets back to that universal design and kind of think back to that sensory room in my son's school. That is something, a sensory room in your workforce could be something, or just like a quiet room, could be something that benefits everybody and is something that increases overall the well-being. and then individually designed. So we do have some things that we will need based on what that individual needs. We will need specific accommodations that they will need to be able to do their work without being hindered by their disability. So some of the beneficial adjustments were building an understanding of autism. So these were things that many people in this study found were beneficial, of things that could be done that were adjustments being made for their disability. Modifying the environment. A lot of it's about sensory. Sensory is a significant issue for autistic and ADHD individuals. ADHD maybe to a little bit lesser extent, and I'm actually going to throw in OCD as well. OCD has a lot of sensory. So when you have somebody with sensory issues, I don't want you to assume the type of neurodivergence, but the chances are there may be some neurodivergence there. The sensory accommodations are things that can be done through a sensory profile. The people that work with sensory differences are called occupational therapists. So they're used to working with adults in terms of fine motor skills after a stroke per se. But a lot of the OTs that work with kids work with sensory issues. And now there are occupational therapists that focus on adults as well. So you can have some that focus on a sensory profile, meaning they figure out what sensory tools are needed for that person to be successful in that workplace or in their home setting. Flexible support in response to anxiety and overwhelm. Autism, ADHD, all of these areas of neurodivergent are dynamic. If you put somebody that cannot spell in a situation that they have to write somebody's name that they cannot understand and cannot pronounce, they're not going to be doing well. That's going to cause them anxiety. In other situations, their spelling isn't going to be an issue at all because we've all got spell check at this point. It's about where that person is and knowing that in that moment, if they did have overwhelm, that there was support there that was needed. Again, not the one and done. It's not you come in, we find out what accommodations you need, and we're done with you. We expect you to do well. It is checking in, making sure that things are going well, and being there and making modifications if there is overwhelm. And then selecting practically easy things to implement. So all of these things really on the left are not things that are huge. The biggest thing is modifying the environment, right? So that is something that can be an issue. Somebody asked a question on the question and answer about working from home. And I'm going to talk with you about that because this is one area where many autistic individuals have actually been more productive at home than they have been working at the office. And that can be the social aspect, the sensory aspect. There's any number of things that can come with that, but that is an example of something we'll talk about here in a minute. But does provide the most flexibility if you do have that ability to modify work from home. Troublesome adjustments, so things that were difficult to accommodate and adjust for, were things that are unchangeable, right? Like if, again, we go back to the McDonald's person in the drive-through, if they are not fast at what they do, that's kind of hard to change that job. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a different job that they can do within that corporation. And I would encourage that if that became an issue, that they do find a different job for them in that agency. However, it is something that's really unchangeable. So that would be challenging to change something like that because that's the way that company works. Also uncontrollable. So think about customer service and all the phone calls somebody has. So if that's something that is a challenge for someone to answer the phone when it calls unexpectedly, that may be something that considered uncontrollable to them and may cause them overwhelm. But we can't change that. So the reason this is troublesome is in a situation where there are calls coming in, that is likely unchangeable. Limited resources. So, this really ADA applies to employers with 15 or more employees. Certainly resources are limited. They're even more limited probably after the pandemic. Business organizations with their buildings have been struggling. So resources are limited. And that certainly is a limiting factor to making adjustments. But we go back to some of those things that can be done at lower cost and work and start there. Monitoring fairness for all colleagues. So we've got individuals that from part of their neurodivergent profile is they're very focused on right or wrong. And that's just kind of the way their brain works. This is not something that we're going to change. And so there is sometimes the concern that it won't be fair for all. And these are even individuals that need that accommodation. These are people that say, well, I know that I need those headphones, but really everybody needs those headphones. So these are the individuals that are worried about everybody. These are also neurotypical employees that may see someone getting an adjustment, such as work from home or sensory accommodations, and say, why don't I have that? So there definitely is that piece that has to be navigated. And then go back to that slide about how do you know if they're neurodivergent? You might not know. Again, they might not know. And we can't go and ask them this question. This has to be something where we have made an environment and a culture that it's safe to discuss these things with the appropriate people in our agency, and then we know what to do from that point on to help them. I'm going to briefly talk about what autistic women want at work. This article is actually both autistic men and women, but what I wanted to do is talk about the workplace masking that comes next. So in this case, the article was called, I would love to just be myself, right? So these are women saying, I just want to be who I am. I don't want to have to mask. And think back to masking causing that overwhelm, causing that allocation of resources to be minimized. We don't want them masking either. And there are some jobs where people can be any way they want to be, and there are other jobs where there is a professional persona that someone has to put on. So it's going to be a matter of figuring out how do we balance those things. But when we really look at what did individuals want, they just wanted a good job person fit. So they wanted a job that fit with who they are. And they wanted a good person environment fit. So not just who they are, but where they were working was important, who they were doing it for. They also wanted stable employment. But even though those two things were there, the fulfilling career and how to get that in stable employment, just as important was that most women believed that they would never have that. And this is specific to autism. And there is a lot of co-occurring things that can occur with autism, including with somebody that's late identified trauma and the things they've experienced in mental health challenges. So that feeds into that at times because they may have low stamina for some of the things that are required for them for work. But this should tell you something. We have this population of individuals who want to work, are telling us what they need to work, but don't believe they're going to get it. So this is where I'm hoping we as an ecosystem of the job industry can start to look at how do we make these things more accessible to individuals. And then masking. This masking is not a phenomenon that just happens with autism. As I said before, it happens to lots of individuals, but it's pervasive in autism and somewhat pervasive in ADHD. So masking is essentially looking at what other people are doing and acting like that, not being true to yourself, and mimicking others at times, saying that you like what they like. These are the people that may look like they kind of just change randomly with whoever they're around. Those are often maskers. They're masking, they're trying to fit in whatever instance they're in because they don't believe that what they have is worthy, or they've actually been discriminated against, and know that if they are authentic to who they are, then they might not be able to hold their job. So what was important about this one is this really looked at what are the concerns with masking, and is there adaptive aspects to masking? We all mask sometimes. There's absolutely adaptive masking. There's times we've all gone to a in-law's home or a spouse's party or something like that and not necessarily wanted to be there and acted happy. That's also masking to some extent. We're talking about pervasive masking that impacts functionality. This is the masking schema that we have here, which shows all the different aspects. And I've got this written out on the next page because this was a little bit hard to see. Excuse me. So masking depended on how open the agency was, how open the employees were. Also a desire to socially integrate. So did this individual want to integrate with others? Did they think it was important for their job? Did they want to connect? Were they doing it to avoid discriminatory or prejudicial treatment? Like, were they afraid that if they were who they were and didn't mask their symptoms, or mask their presentation, that they would not have a job anymore? They may mask for better employment outcomes. They may want to stay in your job. They may want to move forward, and they may mask to make sure that they can do that. When they do mask, it's typically presenting as an inauthentic self. It is being like someone else so that you can be more accepted. It is unique in that it really changes in situations. They can mask one way at home and another way at the office, and it's widespread. It happens in lots of different places. So why does that become important? Because when we know autistic and neurodivergent individuals mask, that's one of the areas that we then have to look at. How do we help them to be authentic to who they are? Do we have an agency and workforce education system that reaches out to individuals that says, if you're struggling with work, or there are things you need, please let us know? These are individuals that when they don't have that outlet and they continue to mask, they go into burnout. So one of the number one things associated with burnout is masking. And again, just think of masking as this is a pervasive thing that's going to happen when individuals do not feel comfortable being seen for who they are. But when we remove that mask, that's when we get to the strengths. If somebody's allocating all that attention or all those resources to masking, we're not getting at their inner strengths and their authentic self. And that's where the innovation and the entrepreneurs come in. When they can just be who they are, that is when we start to see the real creativity. And then this actually just shows what then happens with this burnout. And that burnout isn't just with masking, but is associated, and this was actually the job demands resource theory, and this was done both for autistic employees and a different research and a couple of slides on dyslexia as well. And what they found is that burnout is really a response to prolonged job stress, characterized by exhaustion, cynicism, and lack of accomplishment. But when they looked at the burnout, it varied based on the work environment and what the job resources and job demands were, and the person resources, meaning their resources and their demands. The balance of those things, when those things are well balanced, we have an individual that's authentic and doing well. When they're poorly balanced, we have somebody going into burnout. So this page is really busy, but the point of this one is we're first going to look at the first two, which is looking at the job itself. So the job resource for them may be coworkers, use of tools, if there's a positive work climate, if there's safety in their job, if there's people they can connect with, if there's supportive professional practices and technology support. Those are all job resources that will help them be connected and do well. Job demands that may pull from them and cause them to lead toward burnout might be high perceived level of stress, sensory sensitivities, overstimulation, place of change. That should say pace of change, meaning like change happens spontaneously without notice. Negative change, where maybe something was going along well and all of a sudden there's a change. One, there's no notice of the change, and two, they perceive it as negative, is really a demand on them. Harassment from others and interpersonal conflicts. So those are things that are inherent in the job that either give them or would give back based on that. And then we have the personal resources of the autistic employee. These are the things that they bring with them to that job. So the personal resources are some of those strengths that we talked about, the memory abilities, the highly specialized skills, the strong detail focus and pattern finding, those visual skills that are exceptionally many times, sensory awareness, information cataloging, all sorts of things that they have as personal resources. But yes, they also have personal demands. They have social differences. They do not socialize the same as others. They do not always conceptualize abstract ideas in the same way. They often struggle with time management. They struggle with self-organizing, task prioritizing, multitasking, and they have low resistance to stress. So when you add these things and you have a workforce where that job is causing demands that are really an issue for that autistic individual, and they don't have the resources to deal with that, then they're going to go into burnout. Now here, they just says a reminder that we're not going to stereotype. We want to always use a personalized approach to this. But then what I wanted to show you is Whistle et al. Showed the same with dyslexia and ADHD. They found that the majority employed part or full-time and experienced challenges throughout their employment. This was both dyslexic and ADHDers. They experienced exhaustion and burnout at work. They also had fear and indecision about the disclosure of dyslexia in particular. And participants experienced a myriad of challenges that included risk of mental exhaustion, discrimination, limited access to support and fatigue, and leaving them vulnerable to job burnout. So think of your employee in this setting feeling this way about something that is true for them, that's been true for them probably most of their life in some circumstances, if it's a neurodevelopmental difference. And they haven't had the ability to understand and share these things. This is something where, again, when we make this open communication where this can be shared, this is when we really start to see the development of these strengths, the commitment to the workforce, that integrity, reliability, and really these individuals that are committed to us as committed to us as employers, excuse me. So the last thing I want to do here, because I'm being mindful of time, we're at 2:46 your time. So I want to review the main areas of neurodivergence. And I just want to specialize or focus on those strengths, because again, we all have heard the deficits over and over again. So what are some of those strengths that we hear sometimes? We hear about reliability for autism, integrity, accuracy, attention to detail, pattern recognition, hyper-focus. You have to be hyper-focused to get through graduate school. I'll tell you, I will stand by that. Innovative, efficient, honest, and dedicated. What do we see with our ADHD and autism ADHD individuals? Energy, creativity, multitasking, not afraid to take risks, so they have a higher risk tolerance. They're very good at problem solving and resourceful. Many of these individuals couldn't learn, pay attention, or socialize the same as their peers in school. So they had to figure out resources to navigate the schooling system, being constantly compared to their peers. So think of the ways that they've had to be creative with navigating through situations. So we want to capture that again now. We don't want to emulate that by getting them back into a situation where they're constantly with what looks to be comparative to peers. We want them to be now realizing where their strengths are and overcoming their obstacles. And then dyslexia, innovative, imaginative. If you look on LinkedIn, there's a Made by Dyslexia hashtag, because that again has had its limelight of the entrepreneurs, the people that are really the business owners. These are people that are many dyslexic and talk about how their success is not something that was accidental. It was due to their learning difference. So what are the take homes for supporting neurodivergent individuals? If they're currently in the workforce, we're looking for opportunities to maintain full-time gainful employment. When they're looking for employment or more reliable employment, we want opportunities to advance, mentorship. Those launching towards school, we need opportunities for mentorship, life skills. We want to do interest-based skills assessment right away. So these next couple of pages, give me just a second. I just got a thing that said that my internet was unstable, so I'm making sure I'm caught up. Okay, so for those that are already in the workforce, follow ADA, but look for opportunities for universal design when possible. Offer adjustments to workspace. Sound sensitivity is a big one. Tactile sensitivity if there's uniforms that they have to wear. Flexible seating, location, that work from home is an important thing to talk about. Use a clear communication style. We often do not understand when someone says one thing and means another. And so we take somebody literally for what they've just said, and we don't pick up some of those inferences. So it's very important to avoid that, especially in the workforce, and provide concise verbal and written instructions. What do we do in recruitment process? We need to change the recruitment, because often we're already omitting neurodivergent individuals by the way we recruit. When we have somebody and we say to them, I need you to do 3 letters of reference and have this resume, and we look at the resume and we say, oh, they misspelled, they're out. Well, you just lost your dyslexic. Or we have first, and you say, no, we always do them in person first. You may have just lost your autistic. So we have to be cautious about how we do our actual recruitment process and see how we can make it more accessible. I would love for you to provide your questions in advance. So if you know there's questions that are going to be asked of somebody, let them actually see them in advance and maybe even write some notes and provide those to you so that in the moment they meet with you. If they kind of lose their words, this is a very common thing with autism, they will lose their words when they get nervous. So those are resources that help build their skill, let them showcase themselves, and make it so that you can actually see somebody that is a potential employee, really not in a situation that could be at their worst. Really interviewing somebody in person with a panel of people is like a nightmare. So those are the sort of situations where we figure out how else can we do that and still get at, could this person be a good employee? And I would love the idea of job shadowing. I would love to see people doing more job shadowing, mentoring, training of individuals before they've agreed to the job, so they understand what it is, they understand what they may need. And then we've got our information for launchers. We need to change what's happening in school so that we're really focused on the workforce and those soft skills, focus on learning about neurodiversity. I actually talk a lot about having neurodivergent pride clubs in school, the same way that we would have other pride clubs, so that people can embrace being different and start to learn when they're young that it's okay to do things differently. And then we will have individuals that are really more ready to launch into that employment and workforce. Okay. I have some books here that I would recommend. These are all written by neurodivergent individuals that describe their process, and also kind of give you a broader view of what that may look like. One of my favorites is This Autism by Dr. Henderson, which is something that really talks about this, what people think autism is, what it actually is, and what it looks like in more subtle presentations, and then the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan. This is by Ben Foss, who is himself dyslexic. I think he's a lawyer. And he coins the phrase ear readers. And he says that we actually discriminate against people that only read, that we really think people should only read with their eyes, like reading on the page, when actually people read just as well, listening to audio tapes and hearing things, and that we should really be considering that as much of a necessity as the eye reading that we do. And Unmasking Autism by Dr. Price, which is very good about neurodiversity. And this is an autistic scientist. So here's way too many references, but I wanted to make sure I included everything that was there. And then this is my contact information and the Birch Price and Associates information. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to open up the question and answer, because we are, oh good, 152. Okay. So I have some individuals that commented that they have autistic individuals in their lives. So I think it's great you have that perspective. And my own neurodivergent kids, I have one that's 23, one that's 16, and one that's 12. So they each have their own challenges. They each have their own strengths, but it definitely is something that to experience that is a very wonderful thing. I did mention the slides, so yes, I will be passing out those slides. As I said, after this, it will just not have my personal information. Okay. So somebody asked that many companies are going with an open workspace concept. What advice would you give on how to provide accommodations for neurodivergent employees? So I can only speak personally. This is something that's quite terrifying to me. So going into a space where everybody has like the barriers, but there's not a ceiling, is immediately sound overwhelm and visual overwhelm. And so if that is what is necessary for your place of business, I would recommend that you have a couple of things for everyone. And this would probably be a universal design, because you've already made a decision to have this universal open space concept. I would have there be quiet rooms. Or maybe you've got a couple of quiet rooms that people can go to if they need some privacy, or you've got a couple of rooms where people can go to if they want to talk when they're not, not in that big group of people. So I think you're really making accommodations for that sensory overwhelm there. I think the other piece then is, what are the demands that puts on individuals from an attention standpoint? When you've got people all in the same group, all of that's being filtered through their attentional system. You're likely going to have less stamina because of that, because you're really causing so much kind of processing at one time. So you may find that if you have that and that works, that's what you need for your company, you may want to look at balanced work schedules, or maybe some work from home and some people work there, but kind of getting some sort of access away from that at times, so that when they're in that moment and they need to be in that space, they're committed and focused, and then they can get a break from that, would be my recommendation. Someone said our workforce is mostly remote. We heard that closed captioning is helpful to some neurodivergent folks when on Zoom meetings. Are there other accommodations that you're aware of that would be helpful for a remote workforce? Yes, closed captioning is really important. And when you're recording, I believe you can actually get a transcript. So you can actually download that transcript and send it. I will tell you that I need closed captioning on everything I watch, whether it's Zoom or whether it's TV. My brain does not process the seeing and the hearing at the same time. And there's many neurodivergent individuals like that. So closed captioning is a good one. I typically do like to have the slides in advance, so I certainly apologize. I did not have those advanced today, but again, I wanted to make sure I pulled out my personal information. And then other resources for remote workforce, I think it's going to depend on the individuals. You're going to have individuals that work remotely that really want some interaction style. And maybe they want that interaction in a like virtual meetup. So maybe once a week you have a virtual meetup with your staff. Maybe you also alternatively offer an in-person meetup and kind of make no expectations about who comes to the virtual one versus one that is meetup in person. I think when you make the expectation that somebody's there, you cause some of the masking, and that doesn't always work well. If you can make it an option, then I think you are in a better place that people will come and do what's comfortable for them, and they'll be more committed and understand that you're making, you're letting them choose what's most comfortable for them. Will the recording be available after the webinar? That's a Burton Price and CEO, I believe so. I will ask, let's see here. One second, I'm gonna stop sharing so you can see me. Okay. David, can you tell me if the slides will be available? I will find that out and I will let you know. Okay. Next one, advice for Zoom team meetings and interviews. So offering virtual was a suggestion, but would that environment further reinforce a preference for less interaction? So, and yes, the slides will be available. This is a very good question. So I'm not recommending that you only do it virtually. I am saying that it may need to be an option. So if you have something that you have individuals that you are starting this recruitment process, maybe you give them an option of the first step is a virtual interview, or you could come in person and see if they would, which one that they would prefer. I do believe that when you've made it through that next step and they now are comfortable with you, they've at least met you and they know a little bit about it, it's going to be less intimidating when they go in person. I still probably wouldn't jump into a 5 or 6 panel group of people, but I think generally you have a main point of connection. You have the person that's connecting with these employees, and that's really what employees want to know. Are they important? Are they special to this company that's trying to hire them? So giving them some decision making about how they get interviewed in the process, giving them some options of would you like things written, and then going in after that to the in-person interview, I think makes sense at that point, because there are certainly things you need to see. I'm not recommending you just do virtual and all of a sudden the next, a week later they show up at your office. I do think there's going to be more vetting than that, but I'm just talking about that whole recruitment process being a bit more flexible to how different people may need that. I will tell you why many people during the pandemic were struggling. My husband being one of them. He really likes to keep busy, and that was very hard for him. It was actually a wonderful experience for me. I put my clinic in the cloud basically, and I actually then became busier during the pandemic than I ever was before, and I've maintained that productivity since that time, because now I only allow 1 day a week where I have people in person and the rest of the time is virtual. So again, you're not going to know based on just meeting somebody what is going to work best for them. You're really going to want to figure out a way that maybe a pre-employment check or a pre-hire check is what are their preference for those things. So again, that means you're listening to them and you're willing to make accommodations. We have like 1 more minute. Does anybody else have any questions or anything that they want to bring up? I'm just making sure all the questions were answered. Okay. Thank you, everyone, so much. It was, thank you for participating and for interacting. That really helped. And so if there's any questions that you have, please let me know. As soon as you get those slides, my email is on there. You can also contact Birch Price. And thank you again. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Take care.